Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
Well, Adam, I alluded to it last week, and I thought it would be good to follow up right with it. We're going to talk about using Microsoft security solutions side by side with other third-party security solutions. So, as we've said, not every customer or organization of Microsoft uses all of Microsoft, and even Microsoft doesn't use all of Microsoft's security solutions. We have other solutions that help bolster it. So today we're going to talk about how you can use a lot of the things that we have as Microsoft security alongside some of these other third-party solutions that you might have. And before we get into it, Adam, if you want to give our typical disclaimer.
Absolutely. If you're a longtime listener of the show, you've heard this a million times, but good for anyone new this week. Andy and I both work for Microsoft. We're in our field security sales business, so not necessarily involved with high-level decision-making, but certainly paid by Microsoft, represent a lot of Microsoft security products. Although the show is not under Microsoft editorial control, they don't tell us what to talk about or what not to talk about. You as listeners should know who signs our paychecks, and of course that's going to influence the way we do the show. So want to be upfront about that instead of having it something you discover after the fact. But at the same time, what we can bring to the table then are things that we have a lot of visibility into because we have in the past or in the present supported many different customers across many different industries. We've observed what works well, what doesn't work so well. And that's the insight we bring to the show. And so that's pretty uniquely valuable compared to someone who may not have that breadth and depth of experience. And so we talk about what we know. And what we know are seeing what enterprises do that works well. And of course, Microsoft's set of security solutions. So let's get into it, Andy.
Yeah, and the goal for today is really to help organizations take advantage of their investment in Microsoft and maybe your current solution already, because as we know, Microsoft sells things as a suite. And so oftentimes you get a lot of these tools included, and you may already have something in place. But the thing is that if you do run them side by side, you get additional telemetry, you get additional insight, visibility, and security. So starting from the top, the biggest one that a lot of people start with is EDR. So maybe you're already a CrowdStrike customer or Sophos or
SentinelOne.
Right. Name your third party. EDR has been around for decades. And so there's a lot of them out there. And so ours is called Defender for Endpoint. It comes with a lot of our security SKUs. So you probably already own some of it, because if you're already an E3 customer, 3G3, A3, MDE P1, which is our baseline SKU, is included. And a lot of organizations are E3. So if you are E3, you do own a portion of MDE and can take advantage of it as well. So the crux of how this works is there's two different modes that MDE can operate in: passive mode and active mode. And as part of that, we need to understand MDAV, or Defender Antivirus. And that is the more legacy, I don't want to say legacy, but it is the agent that is built into Windows machines. And that's what does the enforcement on Windows. And then for newer systems or other operating systems like Mac OS and Linux, it is MDE because it has been engineered to be the Defender for Endpoint version of it. But on Windows, the Defender AV agent is what does the enforcement. And so let's talk about Windows first, because by bulk, the majority of organizations use Windows, and that's probably your dominant operating system. So for Windows, the agent is built in. There's not anything to install or uninstall. Well, you can technically uninstall it, but it is built in and installed by default. So for workstations, Windows 10 and 11, whenever you deploy a third-party EDR solution on Windows 10 or 11, the AV agent automatically goes to passive mode. So that's not something you have to worry about. What you can do is onboard that device to Defender for Endpoint, which is the cloud portion of it. That's the extended detection and response in the cloud to give you that cloud visibility rather than just the AV agent on the device. And those policies on the device are either scoped through group policy or done through MDE plus Intune, or a combination of all of those, or MECM. And so that AV agent is locally managed on the device, but then you have that visibility that extends that alerts and detections into the cloud by onboarding into MDE, which is just a simple PowerShell script that can be deployed via whatever device management solution that you have. And so for Windows 10 and 11, fairly simple. If you already have something that's installed on the device, like a CrowdStrike, you can still onboard that device without any additional user disruption to MDE. And what you get is that visibility into the Microsoft estate. And there's additional things that we can do that we'll talk about as MDE is in passive mode. And what's important is you're still using that primary EDR solution for your enforcement, because that Defender AV agent goes into passive. And so it's just looking at visibility, at signals, and you're using your primary EDR as the enforcement agent. For servers, there's a little bit more involved. If you're planning on using MDE on servers, you need to set the AV agent to passive or uninstall it, right? So if you're using a third-party EDR solution, you're probably already doing this through some sort of group policy, or however you're doing management. You're setting it to passive or uninstalling the sensor, the Defender AV agent, when you install your third party. If you plan on doing that for MDE, you want it to be in passive. Obviously, you don't want to disable the agent completely or uninstall it if you're planning on using MDE. So if you're going to use MDE side by side with something on servers, you need to set the MDAV to passive, install your third-party EDR solution, and then onboard it to MDE using the script. And setting it to passive on a server is pretty simple. It's just a registry key. So you can do that through group policy or MECM or some other device management. Mac OS has an MDE agent that you can install. You can also set it and onboard it in passive mode. When you onboard a Mac OS device to MDE, there's a configuration file that goes along with it. You could just use the default one, but if you want to set it to passive, there is a flag within that configuration profile that you just need to set enforcement equals passive. And the same thing for Linux. Linux can also be onboarded in passive mode. So we've talked about kind of this passive mode and why it's important. Like, for example, when you onboard it to any device in passive mode, it will go into the Defender portal, the security portal. You will have visibility into that asset. You will have things that get lit up from traffic that it's seeing, from alerts that it might be seeing, but it won't take any enforcement. But there are some things that you can do in passive mode. For example, last week, we went into depth on automatic attack disruption. Automatic attack disruption will work in passive mode. And so it's an orchestration of all the other solutions that we have, like Defender for Identity, Defender for Office, all of those different things, Entra, all those signals. As you're using more and more of Microsoft, because you've onboarded to MDE, it can then extend that signal to say, we're using a compromised identity, because automatic attack disruption is at its core an identity protection solution, and cut off resources that a compromised identity using that MDE signal, it can disrupt that attack. So automatic attack disruption, one of the unique capabilities in the entire security stack, can be used with MDE in passive mode. Endpoint DLP is another one. So if you're using our Purview stack, which is data protection, and you want to have endpoint DLP, like, for example, transferring DLP information from your host to a USB drive. That right there, right, is data crossing over a barrier into an uncontrolled environment, and endpoint DLP can stop that. We use the Defender for Endpoint sensor in order to block that. And you can deploy it in passive mode. So no problem if you have a third-party solution on there, but you do need to onboard it to MDE. So take advantage of that if you own licensing for Endpoint DLP. And there's some other things, like I said, overall, you're going to get that signal in. The more Microsoft you're using, the better. Any comments on the EDR section that we just went over, Adam?
This is actually pretty common. If you're listening to this and you're a little skeptical and kind of thinking to yourself, gosh, why would I do this? Well, number one, a lot of organizations own Defender for Endpoint today through, as Andy mentioned, purchasing a suite like Microsoft 365 E5. Maybe they found a lot of value in the rest of the suite. And they got this even though they didn't need it because they're using CrowdStrike or Palo Alto or SentinelOne or whomever. And it comes down to, would it really hurt to have a second set of eyes on your endpoints? Well, if you have conflicts on the endpoint, then yes, it would hurt. If there's performance degradation, then yes, it would hurt. But that's not the case here. Passive mode ensures there's no conflict between the active protection platform on the device. Defender for Endpoint kind of just hangs back and monitors and watches. And because it ships as part of the operating system on Windows, and it's co-developed with the Windows development team, it is very efficient. It is very mindful of resources. And you are not going to get that huge performance degradation hit from thinking, well, I don't want to run two agents. I don't want the agents to conflict. Again, it's built into the OS and it doesn't conflict. So now you say, well, why not? As Andy mentioned, you get that telemetry flowing into the Defender XDR portal, which you can use during your investigations from maybe other solutions you are using. You're using Defender for Office. You're using Defender for Identity. You're using Entra ID. Now you have that endpoint telemetry in line instead of having to correlate it yourself in a SIM or having to pivot to another dashboard to view it. Even if it's not your primary solution, you trust the protection of another solution more, having that telemetry is never going to hurt you. Having more data is never going to hurt you. So that's one thing. Andy walked through automatic attack disruption, and we didn't really touch on it, but if you have EDR in block mode, even if you're set to passive mode, it can still take action on events that the EDR has detected are potentially malicious or bad things are happening as well. So even when Defender Antivirus is in passive mode, Defender for Endpoint with EDR in block mode can still help protect your endpoints. Again, that second set of eyes. So organizations do this at scale that have standardized on another tool, have installed probably hundreds of thousands of endpoints in this mode today. So this is a supported state. Microsoft will support it. And it is not a flying car, anything. It's something real you can do to just give yourself more protection. And so it kind of comes down to, okay, if there are not a lot of drawbacks and there's a lot of benefits, why would I not do this? Especially if I already own the license for it. And that's where a lot of organizations end up, and they get to that point. And as Andy mentioned, although the story is best on Windows because we have that unique capability of being built into the operating system, we have written excellent agents on other platforms like Mac OS and Linux. And they also support passive mode. Again, getting that second set of eyes and not conflicting with the primary protection platform on those endpoints as well. So encourage you to check this out. This is of probably all the use cases we talk about where you're going to run side by side. This is maybe number one or number two, because the next one we're going to talk about is also very, very common, but certainly something worth investigating. Check out the documentation in the show notes. Contact your Microsoft account team if you want to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. Many organizations do this, and many do it at scale, hundreds of thousands of seats. So the next one, we're starting with the two big hitting ones,
yeah.
Right, is Defender for Office. And that is, by legacy or by history, it's the email protection, but has evolved because Defender for Office is not only an MX record email protection, secure email gateway, but it is also API protection across the M365 estate. And so when we talk about MX record protection, that's generally associated for the most part with pre-delivery protection. So we did a whole show on Exchange Online protection and Defender for Office, and you can go back and take a look at that because we went in depth on pre and post delivery. But the thing is that when we talk about using it side by side, you can only have one MX record protection. So if you're using like a Mimecast or a Proofpoint or something like that, you can only have one at the MX level. So if you're going to use that with Defender for Office, very possible, because MX records just protect email and that's it. So what happens? The big one is Teams. What happens if a malicious file is dropped in Teams, or if I send a phishing link to Atom within Teams, right? When you click on that, there needs to be API protection for that. And there's vendors out there with API protection, like Checkpoint, and Abnormal is another big one that you probably heard of. And so all of these different solutions can work together. So let's say you use Proofpoint. You can use MDO as well with that Teams and M365 protection. You can also still use it as a secondary filter. Like if Proofpoint misses it, then maybe MDO will catch it pre-delivery, and then we have zero access hour purge for post-delivery, as well as the API protections if you're launching a link within Teams or other, Word documents, SharePoint sites. Now for email, it'll probably pick up, if you're using a Mimecast or a Proofpoint, it'll probably rewrite it from the email itself. But outside of email, you're using that M365. So MDO has that protection. And the same thing would work if you have like something like a Checkpoint or an Abnormal. You can use MDO as the MX level protection and then have, an Abnormal or something like that fit in post delivery with that API, which again, a lot of people do this. This is a very common thing to have MDO with another solution if they already own it. What I would recommend is, on any of these solutions, recommend that you can try them on their own. I feel like Microsoft will stand on its own, but this show is all about that integration or, side by side, how it can work and not have any detriment to your security. So MDO is a great one. It'll both work with MX record protection and API protection with other third-party solutions in that same space.
This, we mentioned 1A, 1B potentially in terms of prevalence of use. And Andy, I like how you really laid out that Defender for Office today is not just like a secure email gateway. I've started calling it's collaboration security for all the ways you collaborate, whether it's collaborating in documents, in Teams, in files shared in SharePoint, OneDrive, or of course email, the world's most popular collaboration platform. It protects all of those things. And if you want to use it with another solution, you also laid out very clearly. If your MX record points to a Proofpoint, a Mimecast, Cisco, it's still going to get handed to the Microsoft infrastructure at some point for processing and delivery to people's Exchange Online mailboxes. And we still will do that pre-delivery detection if you want us to. So if you already own Defender for Office, you're not out anything turning on safe links, safe attachments, and getting that zero-day detonation and checking of everything that's coming in. And again, that's second set of eyes on all of your email flowing through. Or, as you also pointed out, if you want to have MDO on the front end, you can augment on the back end with API level protection as well. But it's a good thing to keep in mind that even if you have another solution in place today, it may not protect all of those collaboration workloads like we laid out: Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, Office documents, and Defender for Office does that as well. So it can be another way to work together and augment your security to have a holistic collaboration security platform. So again, I don't see really any downside to having both on at all. Keep in mind, the one thing we do tell people is we rely in Defender for Office on a lot of the signals that come from initial mail delivery, the way the mail is handed to the Microsoft infrastructure, and use a lot of those signals to make detection decisions. When we are getting handed the message after it's already been analyzed and flowed through another provider like a Proofpoint, a lot of those signals are stripped from the message as it's delivered to us. So Proofpoint may miss it, and we may miss it too, just because we don't have the benefit of all of those initial signals from the way the email is initially delivered. And so I do think it's worth pointing out that it's not a completely fair comparison to say, well, it passed them and it passed you, so you didn't do any better. We're not most effective as being that second pass as we are as first pass, because there's just some things you can't see. However, it doesn't hurt to have that, again, second set of eyes. So just want to call that out. And then finally, as Andy mentioned, the purpose of this show is telling you how to get solutions to work well together. But I will also make the suggestion that of all of the product group teams that have been working really hard to improve their solution, I'm not sure anyone has worked harder and shown more rapid improvement than the MDO team. They have been sharing some internal metrics with us on the improvement of the catch rate in this solution, and they truly believe today they're top of the class on this category, that they have exceeded everyone. And that's something they've never said before. They have traditionally been very conscientious to say things like, we think we're comparable. We think we're in the same ballpark as the other vendors. And they've been very bold. And this is literally within the last couple of weeks coming out and kind of telling us internally, we think we're the best. We think we're top of the heap now. So they've worked really hard. And so if you haven't done an evaluation recently where you would give Microsoft a shot to maybe be that first catch, it may be worth another look to see if it can meet your needs now, because they have worked their tails off on this and have built in some new cool technology there as well. So kind of a side tangent, but worth pointing out just because it's topical and it's newsy as of right now. That team is working really hard on the efficacy of Defender for Office and are showing really good results from it.
All right, so let's move on to identity. So for identity, let's talk about Entra and conditional access. So one of the most powerful things that Microsoft has as far as identity goes, we do have identity protection built into the Entra stack, but also conditional access. And conditional access is super powerful. And because Microsoft has endpoint management, so identity and endpoint management kind of go hand in hand. And we're going to go into Intune following this, but I want to touch on compliant device. So oftentimes, how do I allow a user to use an enterprise application, but make sure that they're only doing it from a device that the company is managing? That's usually a question that security professionals ask. I don't want my company OneDrive to be accessed on a user's personal computer. So we need to make sure that that's managed, it has correct, policies enabled and everything. You do that through conditional access, right? And so conditional access can be used for just M365. Let's say you're using an Okta or a Ping or some other third-party IDP. You can use conditional access specifically just for Microsoft, because no matter what, those signals are going to travel through Entra. Now, you could have Okta, say, be the front door. So you authenticate and you federated your Entra with Okta. And so Okta's the front door. And then that passes the token to Entra. But when it hits Entra, you have a conditional access policy that says, oh, must be on a managed machine. And then that triggers checking to see whether that machine is enrolled in Intune. So that's one way to take advantage, because when you do that, you can have all sorts of different conditional access policies to make sure that you're on a compliant device, you're coming from a network that you're supposed to, you have MFA. Now, if you do MFA, that will trigger a secondary MFA. So that's usually not something that we want to do. Is, let's say you have Ping or Okta as the front door and you have must MFA, they're going to MFA there. And then if you have a conditional access policy that says must MFA, most of the time that will, unless there's some sort of integration built in, but in most of my experience, that's going to trigger an MFA from the Microsoft Authenticator app a second time. And there might be situations that you want to do that. I don't know, but not a great user experience. But then you also have that risk-based conditional access. Again, risk-based is taking in the signals from every single sign-in. And again, all those sign-ins do still pass through. If it's going through an app or something that's federated to M365, it will see that signal and evaluate that signal. And it also gets user signals. If you're getting stuff from their devices, if you're getting stuff from their applications, it aggregates all those signals into a risk, which we talked about in previous shows as well. And so you can use that risk-based conditional access. Let's say the user is using a password that we see on the dark web. So you have password protection built into the Entra applications. You can then trigger a self-service password reset automatically for their Entra. And if you're syncing passwords back and forth, that can write back to on-prem, so on and so forth. So there's a lot of different ways from an Entra standpoint that you can still take advantage of that, specifically that integration with Intune. Now I'm going to pitch something that might be a little bit radical that I actually didn't hear of until just recently. So just like you can have Okta be the front door and then pass that sign in to Entra, and let's say you didn't have any conditional access on Entra, that sign-in would just go straight through because it's federated and you'll sign into the application. From the user perspective, it's seamless, right? I sign in with Okta, I get into my Microsoft applications. You can do it the opposite way too. So let's say you want Entra to be the front door because it has all of those signals. Specifically, let's say manage devices as a capability here, right? So if I want an Okta federated application, say you're using Salesforce and Salesforce is federated with Okta, but I want only managed devices to be on to be using Salesforce. Now, Okta has something built in called trusted devices, but it is limited. It's not as robust. And I'm going to tell you, as a former Okta administrator, it's not as robust as Intune. It just isn't. We have better ways to trigger that conditional access versus Okta. And so what you can do in that case is actually, just like you federated Entra with Okta, you can do it the opposite way. You can federate Okta with Entra. Have Okta be an enterprise application within Entra, have Entra be the front door, have all those great conditional access signals trigger, and then we pass on the successful sign-in to Okta and then onto the application. So that is one way that you can. Now, you might ask, like, why would I ever do that? Maybe you have 1,000 applications within Okta and it's difficult to move, or, there's a lot of integration or whatever. Instead of having to spend a lot of man hours or transferring that over, one easy button is just have Entra be the front door and you get all of those signals and that first pass at that identity with the conditional access policies that you are taking advantage of, which is, again, fairly unique to Microsoft's identity platform. It's something that is extremely robust, extremely granular, and have that be the front door and passing that successful signal on. Just another food for thought there.
A little curveball there. I'd never heard that suggested before. That could also be a valuable use case if you're doing a migration and you are going to need to migrate all of those apps over time. That might be the cleanest way to do it. And in all honesty, we're talking about a lot of scenarios where you're using both because you're licensed for both for whatever reason. And we're not going to get in on this show why you might be licensed for both. You just are. And it really comes down to, if there's one thing where Entra, I think, is clearly superior to any other identity platform. And again, Microsoft guys saying this, so you can take your own grain of salt with it. It's everything Andy talked about with the conditional access policies and that integration with device management. That really is our Big Mac sauce. It's our secret sauce. Having the confidence to know this device is compliant right now as they go to sign in. And if it becomes non-compliant, we'll kick them out, is very helpful. And for the most part, the other identity platforms are nowhere near that level of interactivity. It's state and time attestation, or it's much more limited in its approach compared to that. So it truly is, if you want to up your security game, Entra ID is the best solution to have the most secure integration of identity and endpoint management. Everything you laid out here is interesting from that coexistence perspective. To be fair, yes, that is a little radical. Most organizations are configured the other way, where Entra is effectively just an enterprise application inside of Okta. And so you sign into Okta, you do your Okta thing, you do the Verify app or whatever. And then if you're going to a Microsoft destination, then you pass through Entra ID at that time. I would encourage anyone who's in that model, and there are not a ton, there are many. I cover 16 enterprise accounts today. I think 3 of them are on Okta. So just to kind of give a sense of prevalence, it's probably under 25% today. If they're in that state, what I go and encourage them to do is say, at a bare minimum, you should have a risk-based conditional access policy turned on for high risk. If it's a high risk sign-in or high risk user risk, you should take some sort of mitigating action. It's going to be very uncommon that happens, very rare, because those are high confidence and high fidelity alerts when we flag those. And it's probably something you should investigate. And it's not going to be burdensome to do so. So I would encourage you to do that. It's just that we keep using the phrase second set of eyes, but there's another one, a second set of eyes from an identity perspective, where maybe Okta didn't catch that identity was compromised, but we suspect it is. And we could potentially help protect an intruder from gaining a foothold in your environment. Andy, you did talk about the password protection, how Microsoft goes out, scans the dark web, looks for password dumps, and will attempt to run those through the same hashing algorithms and see if they match a password hash. stored in Entra ID. Now, if you're an identity administrator and you've stood all this up, you may think, Andy, I can't use password hash synchronization and federated identities at the same time. That's actually not true. You can. It is entirely possible to turn on password hash synchronization, even if that's not your current authentication method. The reason why you do this is for high availability or disaster recovery. In a scenario in which the other identity provider becomes available, this happened a lot in like the ADFS days when people were rolling their own ADFS environment, then you can flip over from federated auth to password hash synchronization authentication. And because you've already synced the password hashes ahead of time, snap your fingers, you're good to go. And now your users can continue to access Microsoft resources, even if that federated identity provider, whomever it is, ADFS, Ping, Okta, is down. And you should, by the way, highly recommend you configure yourself in that state. And so as long as password hash synchronization is turned on, even if you're not using it to authenticate, all of those detections still work. Like leak password detection will still work and would still flag a high-risk user event as an example, and potentially block that user from signing in, or as Andy said, do a self-service password reset as well. So this is the third time we'll say second set of eyes. Even if you're on another identity provider, it's not going to hurt you and it's not going to be burdensome on you if at a minimum, my takeaway would be turn on high risk events in sign in and user risk. And if you get those, either do a mitigation or block. And it's not going to be high volume. You're maybe going to run into 15 of those, 20 of those a calendar year tops that you'd have to investigate. And they're usually high confidence and likely compromised, and a true positive. So I would certainly encourage that. And it's one of those no harm, no foul things. If the first identity provider catches it, great, good on you, Okta or Ping. But if they didn't, man, Microsoft just saved your bacon. So it's worth doing, and really no downside to doing so. So strongly encourage that.
So we're going to flow into Intune, but it's really important that when we talk about Intune and compliant devices, that triggers from Entra and that conditional access policy for compliant device. Now, where you get that signal to say this device is compliant, that will differ on what you're using for device management for that type of operating system. For Windows devices, Intune is really if you're going to use compliant device, Intune is kind of the only signal that matters. You can't use third party for Windows, but if you're using third party for say Android, iOS, which is often where organizations start, where they're quote unquote MDM device management, or Mac OS, if you're using a third party for that, you can forward those signals and integrate with Intune and that compliance device conditional access policy. So there's a whole list. We're going to have a lot of links in the show notes here, but just off, the big ones on here, IBM Mass 360, Jamf Pro, Vante, VMware Workspace ONE, those are some of the kind of the big ones. Citrix Workspace Device Compliance. If you're using a lot of those, and there's a whole list within the documentation of third-party device compliance partners. And this is a tab that's built into the Intune portal. You go into the device compliance partner, follow documentation to link that MDM to Intune. And what happens is, let's say you're using Jamf Pro. Jamf Pro is a big one that a lot of organizations use for Mac OS. You have someone that signs into, say, email on their Mac. You have a conditional access policy. Whether you're using Entra as the front door or a third-party IDP, that signal will travel through Entra at some point, trigger the conditional access policy, say, hey, I have something that requires compliant device for email. Now it's going to go to look for where that compliance signal is coming from. By default, we go to Intune. Okay, but you have this device compliance partner configured. It says, oh, well, Intune's actually not the compliance end all be all here. We're going to forward that and ask Jamf Pro whether or not this device is enrolled in sending a compliance signal. Jamf Pro replies, yes, it's enrolled. It's compliant. Boom. Intune says it's good, forwards it back to Entra. Entra says, yay, it's a compliant device. We allow you to sign in. And so it's, again, seamless for the user as long as they know that Jamf is your macOS MDM solution. And if it isn't enrolled, it should trigger an enrollment for Jamf at that point. Same thing for any of the other device compliance partners. Now, what's important is when we say compliant, that may mean different things for other MDM providers. For Intune, When we say compliant, it is a continuous attestation with a compliance policy that is looking to make sure that that device is continuously compliant. Now, other vendors, in my experience, have said, okay, as long as it's enrolled and the configuration policies have been deployed, which configuration policies are very different than compliance policies. Configuration is a one-time, it's enrolled, it changes the configuration of the operating system. Like, let's say you want your device password to be 12 characters, right? And it was 8 characters to begin with. And it says, hey, user, it's enrolled. You must have 12 characters. It's a one-time configuration. Most of the time, once they do that, and if it's that setting's not locked, the user can go back and change it. And so it's not continuously pushing that policy out. Now, some vendors do that. Sometimes vendors are like, hey, I checked, you changed it, I'm going to reset it. So it's good to like review your MDM provider's compliance capabilities to make sure that it is continuously like what happens if the user tries to change it, is that setting locked, so on and so forth. But what's important is in this case for the third party, we're getting that signal and then we're feeding it back to Entra and you're good. So integration there. And then I'm going to flow right back to the last thing that we're going to talk about, which is CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker. Our solution at Microsoft is Defender for Cloud Apps. And there are integrations, and there's a whole page with integrations with external solutions like Zscaler or Open Systems, Manolo. And so with these, you would use, like Zscaler is a big one. A lot of customers are using Zscaler. You can use that agent that's installed on the device for Zscaler to send signals back to Defender for Cloud Apps on what the user is using. And you might say, well, I already have it in the Zscaler portal. But again, we have that whole suite of signals. And if you're getting those signals back, now we're at least integrating that with your Microsoft security stack. And again, like Adam said, oftentimes this is something that you already own, regardless of why you own it. We're not going to get into it, but let's take advantage of it. You can integrate that signal with Zscaler, bring those applications into Defender for Cloud Apps, and you can even take enforcement from Defender for Cloud Apps and use that Zscaler agent to do the enforcement. So if I see an app and I want it blocked from the Defender portal, I don't have to like pivot to another admin portal and block it from there. I can just hit the revoke button within Defender for Cloud Apps, or unsanction, I should say.
Unsanctioned, yeah.
And then it will flow right over to a Zscaler and put it on a block list and automatically block it. And reverse is capable too. If you sanction it, it will then remove it from there and go from there. So there's integrations with that as well. And the most important thing is, again, trying to take advantage of everything that you own. You paid for it. If you own the licensing, might as well use it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good way to wrap up. And Microsoft's overall kind of strategy with the security space is the more alerts we can bring into the XDR portal and let our correlation engine chew on them and turn them into incidents with all those alerts mapped on a timeline, brought together across domain, the more empowered security defenders are going to be. And so again, even if you may use different workloads or different solutions for different workloads, different security domains, if you can still capture some telemetry and bring it to the table in the XDR platform, you're going to make that investigative experience more powerful and more easy to use, and more holistic viewpoint end to end on any given security incident. So that's really the strategy here. But as we've walked through, just there's integration where this talks to this and this talks to that. And even if you don't want to use it as your primary solution, if you can enlighten it with what's going on, it makes that tool more effective. So just across the board, again, why you own all these solutions is another concept for another time. But if you own them all today and you have duplicative licensing where you own multiple solutions, light them both up, get more value, get more eyes on the problem. Why not? It's just, unless you would have conflicts or performance degradation, like I talked about up top, and you're not going to, because as we walk through with all of these solutions, there are ways to properly configure them so there is no conflict. There is no challenges with bad user experience or anything else. There's a right way to do all of this where you can light this all up and just double your visibility without really any downsides. And if that's the case, that's really win-win.
Absolutely. So hopefully you learned something. go and do, implement, make your organization safer. That's our show for this week. Thanks for watching and listening. As always, our contact information along with the links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future, please email us. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.